Look at any old map of Edo. Not the castle. Look at the ordinary streets. Every few blocks, there is a gate. Not a city wall, not a fortress door. Just a wooden gate standing in the middle of a residential lane with a small shack beside it. There were more than 1,000 of them threaded through the city, and every night, at around the hour the bells called yotsu, roughly 10 in the evening, every single one of them was shut. Hold on to that gate. You will need it later. Because by the early 1700s, Edo, the city you now call Tokyo, was almost certainly the largest city on the planet, something close to 1 million people, packed into wooden houses along canals and alleys, in an age when London had not yet reached 700,000. And the police force of that city numbered fewer than 300 men. Not 300 in each district, 300 in the entire city. So how do you keep 1 million people in order with 300 men? Start with the count, because even the count is strange. In 1721, the Shogunate carried out a census of the townspeople, the machikata, and recorded a little over 500,000 commoners. That is only half the city. The other half were samurai households, and the government never counted them the same way.
Which means the famous figure, 1 million, has always been an estimate. Historians build it by adding an uncounted warrior class to a carefully counted merchant one. You are already in a city that did not fully know its own size. Now, look at who policed it. Edo was run by the machi-bugyo, the town magistrates. There were 2 of them, one office in the north of the city, one in the south, and they did not work at the same time. They alternated. One office took all the city's business for a month, while the other office stayed closed to the public and processed its backlog. Then they swapped. Under each magistrate sat about 25 yoriki, mounted officers of low samurai rank, and roughly 100 to 120 doshin, the foot patrolmen you have seen in every samurai film carrying the forked iron staff called a jite. Add both offices together at their fullest, and you are looking at something under 300 men. 300 for 1 million. Modern Tokyo runs more than 40,000 officers. But it is worse than that, and this is the part that should stop you. Those 300 men were not allowed to police most of the city. Roughly 2/3 of Edo's land belonged to the samurai estate, the great walled compounds of the daimyo lords and the shogun's retainers.
Another sizable slice belonged to temples and shrines. The commoners, half the population of the city, were squeezed into something in the neighborhood of 15% of the ground. And that 15% was the only place the town magistrates' men had authority. A samurai residence was not their jurisdiction. Temple land was not their jurisdiction. A warrior who committed a crime fell under a completely different office. Your 300 officers were not Finn. They were 300 men fenced into a fraction of the map. Worse still, being a policeman was not their main job. The machi-bugyo was not a police chief. He was the city. He was the judge who heard lawsuits, the magistrate who registered land transfers, the official who set rice prices in a shortage, the man responsible for bridges, wells, waterways, and the fire brigades. Oka Tadasuke, who held the southern office from 1717 to 1736 and became so famous that Japan still tells stories about his courtroom judgments, is remembered as a great judge, but one of his most consequential acts was organizing the townsmen's fire companies, the machi-hikeshi, into brigades named after the syllables of the alphabet. Fire, not crime, was the thing that could kill 100,000 people in a night.
So subtract the courtroom work, the paperwork, the water supply, the firefighting. What is actually left to walk a beat in a city of 1 million? Almost nothing. And yet Edo worked. Foreign visitors in the following century wrote with something close to irritation about how safe the streets felt. Something was holding this city together, and it was not the men with the iron staffs. Here is the answer most people reach for: terror. And there is real evidence for it. Edo justice was public, and it was harsh. Thieves could be tattooed, a ring of ink around the arm marking them permanently as convicted. Offenders were paraded through the streets before punishment. Serious criminals were exiled to the volcanic island of Hachijaima, effectively forever. Executions happened at grounds on the edge of the city, and the heads were displayed where travelers entering Edo would see them first. So the theory writes itself.
a brutal state frightened a million people into behaving. Except that theory does not survive contact with the rest of the world. 18th-century Europe hanged people for stealing cloth. Public executions were routine in London and Paris. Those cities were not orderly. Harsh punishment was normal everywhere in that century. Edo's outcome was not. Fear was in the room.
Fear was not the mechanism. The mechanism was that Edo did not have a police force at all. It had 400,000 of them. Understand how a commoner's neighborhood was legally built, and the whole thing turns inside out. Edo's townspeople lived in units called cho, blocks, and the block was not just an address. It was a legal body. It had officers, it had a budget, it had records, and it had responsibility. When the Shogunate issued an edict, and thousands of them were eventually compiled into collections like the Ofuregaki Kampo Shusei, assembled in the 1740s, that edict did not go to a police department. It went to the blocks, and the blocks were expected to enforce it on themselves. Beneath the block sat the goningumi, the 5-household group. 5 neighboring households were bound together as a single unit of liability. If one of them committed a crime, the other 4 could be punished for failing to prevent it. If one of them could not pay a tax, the other 4 covered it. Sit with that for a second. Your neighbor's crime is your crime. Then there was the landlord. Most Edo commoners rented, often a single room in a back alley tenement. And the landlord, the oya, was not a businessman collecting money. He was a legal guarantor. He vouched for who you were.
He kept the paperwork for who lived in his rooms. If a stranger wanted to move in, someone had to stand behind that stranger's name, and if that stranger turned out to be a fugitive, the man who vouched for him answered for it. There was a saying that the landlord was like a parent and the tenant like a child, and it was not sentimental. It was a description of liability. And in the middle of each block stood a small guardhouse, the Jishinban, the self-watch station, staffed not by government officers, but by the residents, in rotation, ordinary men, sitting up through the night in their own neighborhood. Now count again. Not 300, every landlord, every household head, every man on watch rotation. A city where the state had almost no eyes, and therefore installed its eyes in the neighbors. The 300 officers were never the police. They were the thin professional layer that arrived after the neighborhood had already identified you, detained you, and decided you were a problem. The Jishi knew this perfectly well, which is why they hired their own informants, the meakashi, sometimes called okapiki, out of their own pockets, and often chose men with criminal pasts, because those were the men who knew the alleys. These informants had no official standing whatsoever.
The most famous investigators of Edo were technically not employees of anything. Which brings you back to the gate, because now you know what it was for. Those 1,000+ wooden gates were not defending Edo from an army. They were the boundaries of the blocks. Every night they closed, and the alleys behind them became something closer to a private courtyard than a public street. A gatekeeper sat in the shack beside them. If you needed to pass through after closing, you did not simply walk. You were seen, you were questioned, and if you had a decent reason, you were let through, sometimes escorted with a lantern to the next gate, where the next gatekeeper looked at you again. You could not cross Edo at night as a stranger. You could only cross it as a sequence of people vouching for you. That is the whole system in one object. A city of 1 million people, cut into 1,000 villages after dark, each one watching its own door. And it did not end when the shoguns did. In 1874, 6 years after the samurai government fell, the new Meiji police built small neighborhood stations across Tokyo, staffed around the clock, embedded inside residential districts rather than centralized downtown. That is the Koban.
There are now something like 6,000 of them across Japan, and part of the job of the officer inside is still the household visit, walking the neighborhood, updating who lives where. Look for the older pattern and you will find it everywhere. The neighborhood associations that still organize your block's festival and your block's disaster drill. The fact that renting an apartment in Japan can still require a guarantor, a named person who accepts responsibility for you. The habit of the resident who notices the unfamiliar car. The last 300 years of Japanese public order were not built by 300 officers with iron staffs. They were built by an arrangement in which safety and surveillance are the same thing, handed to your neighbors, and paid for by never quite being anonymous. So here is the bargain Edo actually struck, and it is the one you have to answer for yourself. You could walk home through that city at midnight, through 1,000,000 people, and be almost certainly safe. And to buy that, you had to live in a place where 5 households answered for your behavior, where your landlord held your name, where a man at a gate knew your face, and where you could not disappear into a crowd even if you wanted to. Every safe city is trading something. Edo just wrote down the price. If you had the choice tonight, which would you take?